Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another edition of the Benchwarmer Sports Podcast. I'm Raffi, joined by Davian, and joined by a special guest, Jonah. Boys, it is finally this time of year. I've had this date. Davian, you know far too well that I've been talking about this time of year for the past several months. I love March so much. I love March Madness. It is right up there with the NHL playoffs of sports, the pinnacle of sports events, in my personal opinion. So I can't wait to talk about this. We're going to have a pretty long show, I'm sure, because there's so much to get to. But before we get into that, and before I just go completely like haywire from excitement, Davian, how are you? Jonah, you're our guest. How are things going? How are you? Happy to have you on. And yeah, how are things before we get started?
Yeah, I'm all good. Especially when it comes to college sports, our viewers know I suck at making predictions. So I brought a somewhat expert Jonah here to kind of give some actual good takes to wipe away, my clown takes. Especially given that we don't run our TikTok as much anymore. Luckily, that's not getting as much clipped. But in any case, I'm doing well. I mean, as you said, it's the best time of the year. I love March Madness. It sucks that Rutgers is not in it. I really thought they're a bubble team that, I really think that, the the athletic director at UNC, really screwed over Rutgers. I really think they should have been in here. I feel like they had all the stats for it. But either way, and that's all jokes. But jumping it over to you, Jonah. How you been? How you feeling? I know we talked a lot about your bracketology. That wasn't very successful, but at the end of the day, when the game is rigged like this, it's very hard to be successful in any case.
I just want to chime in real quick, Jonah, before we hand it off to you. I do appreciate Davian bringing you on. Davian, I know you were in a tight spot as well. Cornell losing in the Ivy League Championship, so there was one of your
No, Jonah and I
picks
both
going.
know that. Yeah.
Rutgers basketball has been a complete disappointment and a complete
I
train wreck
know,
this
I
year, so
know,
that
I
was
know.
another pick. You
Yeah.
still do have Alabama. Tulane,
I do.
unfortunately,
Roll
is
Tide,
not
roll
here, but
Tide.
you have Alabama. But unfortunately, your Cornell, Alabama, Tulane fantasy in the Final Four, unfortunately, it's just not happening.
No,
But
no, just not
at
happening.
least Jonah can provide some sustenance and pitch in a little bit and hopefully guide you to
Yeah.
some bracket predictions. But yeah, Jonah, I'll hand it over to you now.
Yeah, all right. Well, first, it was a wild weekend. St. Patty's Day was very interesting. On Selection Sunday, though, very locked in, just trying to look at my projections, see if I wanted to make any changes, and some of it ended up I ended up making some changes, tinkering at the end. That ended up being wrong. I hate myself for doing that, but sometimes the heat of the moment gets to me. It was an interesting selection show to say the least. But I'll hand it over to you first, Rafi, if you have any underlying thoughts, and I'll try to explain what I can take from the committee.
The first thing that I want to discuss, and I want your insight as well, which was really surprising to me, is majority, if not all bracketologists, or at least notable bracketologists, had West Virginia in the field of 68. Many of them had West Virginia as a borderline lock. Yes, they lost to Colorado in their first game in the conference tournament, which was obviously, I think, a big hindrance for why they didn't get in and why they could have been left out. But to see North Carolina with only one quad win, a quad three loss, I get the non-conference strength of schedule is really good for them, and over underlying numbers favor North Carolina. But the fact that North Carolina got in over West Virginia is a complete undersight by the committee, and it's very sus too when you have the athletic director of North Carolina chairing the committee. So I don't know if you had any thoughts on this. I don't know if you had North Carolina in your bracketology or West Virginia in or out, but that was probably the biggest thing that I came away with from the bracket being revealed was how could you leave West Virginia out and how did you put North Carolina in?
Yeah, I am not entirely sure what happened in that committee room. So I had North Carolina as my third team out. I actually had Xavier behind them as my fourth. I was low on them. I expected the committee, who in years past did show that at some point you have to win games, and I thought 1-12 or 1-9 would be a complete non-starter as just a team, even in a year like this where the bubble is objectively weaker. But the one thing that stumps me is the inconsistency. Like, I'm not sure if you listened to what the committee chairman said. Matt Norlander asked them some questions, like actually exactly how we do have
Love
West Virginia
Norlander.
out, and they mentioned that West Virginia, they had Tucker DeVries come over from Drake.
Oh yeah, that was
the DeVries injury, and they said, okay, it is fair that West Virginia got some good wins. They beat Gonzaga. They beat Arizona on neutral sites. I think it was in Maui. And that accounted for 2 of their quad 1 wins. But that's still not accounting for the fact that West Virginia had 4 quad 1 wins even without them. Sure, some of them were coming to fake wins. Like at Cincinnati, at Utah, those aren't really tournament teams, but they're still road games. Winning on the road is hard in college basketball, and there's still teams that are going to be tough to beat. And that's also, they beat other legit teams too. Like they beat Iowa State at home and they won at Kansas. And my biggest inconsistency here is actually not with North Carolina, but rather with Baylor. Because Baylor, in the middle of February, they had an injury to one of their bigs, Josh Ojawuna. And since then, Baylor not only has a losing record, but they were 0-5 in quad 1 opportunities, including a quad 2 loss at Colorado. Like, it just baffles me that they considered this injury to DeVries when we've seen what they are without DeVries. Sure, it's not good, but I had West Virginia in Dayton. I was a bit lower on them. Clearly, I wasn't low enough. But I also had Baylor on my 11 line, and I thought that inconsistency was completely blasphemous.
100%. And then you look on top of it too with Iowa State. I'm blanking on the guy's name. I'm trying to look it up right now, but their top player, Iowa State, right after the bracket gets revealed, is like, oh yeah, he's not going to be able to play. And you'd have to imagine too that Iowa State, they were like, let's get the 3 seed and then we'll come out and say that this player is injured and is going to be missing the tournament, because you'd have to imagine by that logic they would have seen, oh, this player is going to be out for Iowa State. We need to bump him down too. And which just still makes no sense to me that an injury would hold that much ground. We saw with Florida State with the CFP last year. Oh, Jordan Travis is out, so they're not one of the 4 best teams anymore. And it defeats the whole body of work argument. Another thing too, and then Davian, if you want to throw in another one after this one. Jonah, do conference tournaments not matter? Because the fact that Michigan beat Wisconsin, both teams, I follow Jerry Palm's bracketology. I love his is my favorite bracketology. Michigan and Wisconsin were both on the 3 line in his bracketology. Michigan beats Wisconsin for the second time recently, wins the Big Ten championship. But from what I watched yesterday, and from obviously what we saw with the bracket, the committee seemed to have a bracket already from the previous night, and decided, you know what, we're just not going to make any changes. Wisconsin winds up on the 3 line. Michigan, with one of the most quad 1 wins out of everyone in the NCAA, somehow is a 5 seed, and then they get paired up against one of the best non-power 5 teams in the whole NCAA in UC San Diego. Jonah, what were your thoughts on that? Because that made absolutely no sense to me as well.
Yeah, thank you for that, Raffi, because that was also very interesting. On the conference tournament points, I think they matter until a specific day. I don't think they're useless. Clearly, Texas played their way into the tournament because of what they did. If they don't beat A&M, they don't get in. I think that's pretty clear and obvious. They had 7 quad 1 wins. We saw West Virginia out with 6, Indiana out with 4. They only had 5 wins going into that tournament. That was clearly what got them in. Something tells me it could be once Friday hits, I think they have a bracket more or less decided and only would make tinkerages if absolutely necessary. And Friday, that's when Michigan started playing. Like, they rattled off 3 straight wins, not just quad 1 wins against protected seeds: Purdue, Maryland, and Wisconsin. And that Purdue win, that was a convincing win as well. It's not like their normal, oh, we're going to squeak out a win, our analytics are going to look terrible, but we have this great record. Like, I thought they were on the 4 seed before that game against Wisconsin, and I kept them on my 4 line, and I kept Wisconsin on my 3, but I thought Purdue had no business being on the 4, and Michigan no business being lower than a 4.
100%. And you look at the comparable 3 seeds too. Michigan has another quad 1 win than Texas Tech. They have a better quad 2 record, 4-2. Texas Tech 3-3. Kentucky 11-10, three more quad 3 losses, 1-1 in quad 2. And again, the strength of the schedule argument can always be applied to almost any team. You could look at any metric you want, but it feels like at the end of the day, the committee can just pick any because there's so many metrics these days, and it's hard to decipher which ones actually mean something. And with all these data points, it's very easy for the committee to be like, oh well, like this random point right here says that Michigan is a top 30 team, so that's why they're completely just like regarding anything else. So I feel like it's just completely convoluted things. I also think too the fact that you had to put 14 SEC teams and you had to obey the rules of we don't want teams playing each other interconference too early into the tournament. I think that also screwed up a lot of the seeding as well. So I think it was really messy. I think it's going to be, I can't imagine 14 SEC teams are going to be in next year. We're going to see that in the future, but I think that also really changed things up. David, any thoughts on the bracket before we continue into the main portion, which is just looking at what we have now and then giving some predictions?
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, Raffi, I mean, I definitely don't have as much insight as you two have really, I mean, you guys have provided amazing insight on the bracketology. I think in my sense, just looking at how everything was done, not including West Virginia, the rank, like how the seeding, I've never seen this before. Like, yes, I understand I'm not the biggest college basketball fan, but I've never seen it screw over this many teams. Like, yes, there have always been the snubs, and there's always been the teams that should have and didn't make it, but this is beyond just the teams that should have and didn't make it. This is also how like the teams were seeded. It's gonna completely change the conference, and there's definitely another world where when there is the right seeding, West Virginia makes it in. What actually happens? Because these games, these matchups, especially as we get along to the Sweet 16, Elite 8, Final 4, we're gonna see really the bracket really have a major effect on these matchups. And even at the end of the day, Florida, right, is like paired up with UConn like on the bracket. Not saying whether that's better, not we can all discuss that, but Florida might have to go through UConn and then Maryland, right? Like that's a much tougher bracket than for other teams on the other side of the bracket. And so it's gonna be interesting to see how much does really playing these intense, tough games throughout the tournament really have an effect on these teams, because it definitely has in the past.
Yeah, I'll just chime in and just close this real quick by saying two things. One, first off, at the end of the day, 68 teams got in. 60, there's like 34 like non-auto bids that got in.
Yeah.
West Virginia, like regardless, they didn't do themselves any favor. The fact that they're out isn't some complete travesty where it's like, oh my gosh, we lost a team that was potentially going to go to the Final Four. We've seen it before, obviously. Yeah. UCLA a couple years ago made it all the way to the Final Four from the first four. Loyola made it very far as like an 8 or 9 seed. I remember that a couple years ago. But like, let's be honest here. West Virginia, the chances of West Virginia going to the Elite 8 even was just not going to happen in all likelihood. So I get the arguments. Obviously, teams make a lot of money from making the tournament, but that's the main thing. The other thing too, Davian, and we'll get into this, I guess, right now. We'll start off just jumping into the South region. Davian, the worst draw in my mind is Auburn. Auburn we're the number one overall seed. And, oh yeah, if you win, which they will, you might play Louisville if they beat Creighton in Kentucky, in Lexington, Kentucky, which is an hour drive away from Louisville's campus. That's terrible for Auburn. Yeah. And Auburn, Janai Broom's dinged up. Auburn's pretty dinged up. I personally, and we'll get into this later, I have Auburn in the Elite 8, but I think Louisville and Creighton are going to give Auburn problems in this region. I don't think Auburn has a really easy path to this. I think, honestly, that might be the hardest matchup that they have to go through out of the first couple of rounds. I just think both those teams, Louisville is underseeded, and I think Cockrunner sizes up really well with Janai Broom, who's been dinged up. In Auburn, you lose 3 or 4 going into this. I have a lot of question marks about Auburn. I think they peaked too early in my mind.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I didn't even know that they play Louisville and the kind of the matchup, how that's set up. Yeah, at the end of the day, like it's definitely not an easy road. Playing Louisville or Creighton, and then playing the winners of playing either UC San Diego, Texas A&M, or Yale. Those are all 4 very good teams. who provide a different, who have a very different style of play in their own fashion, and definitely going to bring a challenge to Auburn throughout the bracket. And yeah, I agree. I also have them. I have them make it to the Sweet 16. Don't have them really going on further than that. But yeah, I 100% agree that Auburn was really screwed over as the number one seed. But at the end of the day, let's be honest, Rafi, this is a team that they didn't deserve all the praise and whatnot, because at the end of the day, they did struggle, especially at the end down the road in conference play and in some of these games.
Jonah, what are your thoughts so far on just looking at the South region? Who do you think is likely to come out of it? What are your thoughts on Auburn? I think this is a big question. Overall, I think I primarily have this going pretty chalk for the most part. I do have Michigan losing to UC San Diego. I think that's a really rough matchup for Michigan. Again, I've already talked about how they got hosed, but just stylistically, from what I've been hearing, UC San Diego is a pretty popular pick over Michigan right now. But aside from that, I'm pretty much going chalk for the most part in this. Jonah, what are your thoughts on the South region?
Yeah, I think at on a macro scale, like when we get to those bigger marquee matchups, we're going to see a lot of chalk. It is a very top heavy year. These one seeds have completely separated themselves. These two seeds honestly have also separated themselves. But I think there's potential for upsets earlier on, like UC San Diego, for example. They can shoot. They're balanced on both sides of the ball. The one concern with the matchup against Michigan just has a lot of size on them, especially
Yeah.
like their bigs, Danny Wolf and Golden. Dusty May is one hell of a coach. Like he is incredible. But like something tells me that UC San Diego is going to take that one. There's potential upsets, I think.
Uh, yeah, I mean, I know all the pundits are saying UC San Diego is going to take it. I mean, they are the best 12th seed of almost all time. I mean, statistically speaking.
Yeah.
But I think that Michigan's size and their coaching is what's going to lead them to the win. So kind of like Euro logic, but flip it around. So, but either way, we can talk about that all day. Jonah, continue.
Yeah, moving down. I'm sorry. I actually have to pull the bracket up for a bit, but
Yeah, you're good.
You're all good, man.
In the meantime, I'm just gonna do a little like producer work right here. Keyshawn Gilbert was the guy that I was talking about, one of Iowa State's top players. He's going to be missing the tournament. And when I look at the South region, I really didn't want to pick Auburn going too far because again, I'm like that Louisville, Creighton, whoever they play, I really don't like it either because they're either playing a road game against Louisville essentially, or they're playing a really good matchup in Kalkbrenner versus Janai Broom, a really good matchup against Janai Broom. So I really am cautious about Auburn, but I'm looking at the other teams. Michigan, again, as I've said, I have UC San Diego beating them. Texas A&M, Yale upset Auburn last year as a 4-13 matchup. Like A&M, they've played well in some stretches. They've also played really bad in some stretches. We saw that in the SEC tournament straight up when Texas took them all the way to overtime, double overtime, I believe, and Texas A&M couldn't get the job done. They've lost to some pretty mediocre teams overall. Ole Miss, I'm fine with them. Not the biggest fan, but looking at the other top seeds, Michigan State, that's probably my pick right now to come out of the South region just because Tom Izzo, it's March. We all know the months of the year. It's January, February, Izzo. Tom Izzo, I picked against him in my Big Ten championship prediction. I had them losing to Illinois. Woof. That was my worst prediction by far. Did have Colorado State winning, though, the Mountain West, so I will flex that to cover up any missed prediction in the Big Ten. I just think this Michigan State team, by all metrics, they rebound really well. They're really good offensively. They're solid defensively. I think this Michigan State team is the team that's going to come out of this region just because it's Tom Izzo. The team's been playing well. Yes, they didn't get the result they wanted in the Big Ten tournament, but I'm looking at these other people. Iowa State, again, with that injury, I think really hurts their chances. And outside of them, I don't like anyone else outside of Auburn or Michigan State to come out of this region. I'm going Michigan State because I don't even like Auburn that much, too.
Yeah, exact. That was actually exactly my logic. I looked and I think both these teams have very easy past the Elite Eight, especially Michigan State, because I think both Louisville and Creighton could give Auburn some problems. And just talking more about Auburn, they had one of the most impressive resumes to date for a long time. They faltered down the stretch, and I think part of that is just regression to the mean. Like they weren't going to keep it up, and part of that is also that teams have kind of figured out how to keep their guards in check. They don't have the like they don't have the scariest they don't have the scariest guards compared to the tournament or say a fellow SEC team like Florida and John Broome. Like if you can contain him, like it can cause a lot of problems for Auburn. And something I do think that like Holloman and Izzo, like the coaching staff, the support that Michigan State has, I think will get them into the Final Four. And just one more thing about upsets. We mentioned Iowa State being vulnerable. Watch out for whoever wins that 6-11 game, whether it's Ole Miss or that plan between UNC and San Diego State. All of those teams easily have the capability of getting to the Sweet 16.
100%. And also, too, I forgot if it was the defense. Yeah, San Diego State, I want to say is 11th or top 15 in defensive KenPom too. So the San Diego State team defends the ball amazingly. I think they're going to be in UNC, and you're absolutely right. I was contemplating San Diego State over Ole Miss, and then again, as we've said numerous times, over Iowa State is definitely feasible in my mind. David, what are your thoughts on the South region?
Yeah, for me out of the South, I got Michigan coming out of it. I have Michigan being Auburn and then going up against Michigan State. I agree that I think that the winner of the Ole Miss of the 6-11 game between Ole Miss and San Diego State or UNC is going to move on to the Sweet 16. I just have Michigan State. I think that they've played lights out kind of throughout the season. Yeah, a lot of their wins have been very close wins. But at the end of the day, I think that size is going to play a very big role, and I think that Michigan's going to figure out how to really use it to their advantage in March. And that's why I have Michigan making out of the South.
All right, let's move into the West now. And the West is an unfortunate one for me because I really, 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 really like Florida. Cannot emphasize that enough. Honestly, a little disappointed that they won that SEC championship game in the fashion that they did because it feels like everyone's picking Florida now. And I kind of wanted to be under the radar and be like, okay, I think Florida, and then look really smart. But I think everyone just saw how good Florida and how dominant they were. And like, okay, this team is going places. And they've been the most dominant team, I'd say, in all college basketball. I personally think that they've passed Auburn as of right now. You can make the argument that both teams are on a similar tier level, but from the past couple, like the last 2 months sample size, I think Florida is playing probably the best basketball in the entire country. They have amazing KenPom numbers, number 2 overall in KenPom. Their offensive rating is first in the NCAA, 10th in defensive KenPom. This team's amazing. They have the size with their forwards and their centers. They have players who can shoot the ball really well. Yes, they have I think overall the team is very inexperienced, so that's a little cause of concern for me. I like to see some experience. As we saw with the Tom Izzo pick that I had, I like an experienced coach who's been in the tournament before. I like players who know what it's like to be in March Madness. But then again, too, I'm also like, well, it was Tom Izzo's first year in March Madness at one point, too. So I really like this Florida team a lot as the reasons why I've listed. I know people like UConn. I know it's a flashy pick, Dan Hurley, etc. This UConn team is not the team we saw the last 2 years. They've had a down year. I'd be very surprised if UConn even put up a fight with this Florida team. And also looking through the bracket too, it's really disappointing that Tyrese Hunter got injured at the end of that American Conference tournament game for Memphis, just because I really like Memphis too with Hardaway. He's been playing really well. They've had solid guards, and it's another solid team. Colorado State's a team that I predicted to win the Mountain West. They won 7 straight going into that tournament. If they lost at any point, as we saw with Boise State missing, they were out of the tournament. So Colorado State was a team I liked a lot. Maryland, the Crab Five, amazing vibes. If I had to pick a non-top 3 seed to make the Final Four, it would probably be Maryland. It's just the fact that they're in Florida's division. Texas Tech, St. John's as well, Rick Pitino. This is honestly, this might be the most loaded quadrant in my personal opinion. I am going to wind up going with Florida over Texas Tech. I really like Texas Tech's defense. I really like their offense as well. They're the only team since I think January who's beaten Houston. They did it by 1 point. I like Florida over Texas Tech, but I think there's really 4 teams that I would not be shocked if they came out of this region, in Florida, St. John's, Texas Tech, and Maryland. I think all 4 teams are really phenomenal and play really good basketball.
Jonah, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I actually have a bit of a different take here. I think Florida arguably has the easiest route to the Final Four of all the one seeds. Like Auburn, obviously they could face Louisville or Michigan State. I think Houston we'll talk about later, but I think awful draw with Gonzaga in the round of 32. And I think Duke might have a bit of an kind of an easy route, but I don't trust them to be fully healthy. I think that could potentially harm them in the future. But Florida, they're they're so talented, they're so deep. They're top 10 on both sides of the ball in the advanced metrics, like our best friend Ken Palm. They're they're clearly playing among their best ball right now. Like I oh yeah, for sure. Maryland, as someone who's from Maryland and supports the Terps, they are. I just think Florida's going to be a nightmare matchup for them because obviously Derek Queen, he's excellent. He's physical. He can he can score. He can kind of do everything you want to. But the problem with Maryland is they're not deep, and Florida is extremely deep, especially on the bigs. I think that Florida is gonna handle Maryland pretty easily, and I'm not convinced on Texas Tech or St. John's to actually make it out of the Sweet 16. Like Bill, like Kansas obviously not playing their best ball. Even Mizzou has struggled a lot away from home actually, but Mizzou especially can get hot, and like when they are hot, they are hard to stop. Like we saw them against Alabama put up 110 points in regulation. Like it's possible they could hit that. Like all the analytics say they're good in that area too. And St. John's, I'm not convinced on just because they're so unbalanced. Be- because yeah, like when I want to see a team who I think can advance really far, I want to see the balance, and they're world class on defense, but they cannot shoot to save their life sometimes, and I think that's gonna give them an exit sometime before the Elite Eight.
Yeah, and it's you look at the previous Final Four contenders, etc., and national champions. The big thing too, as you mentioned, is that balance. St. John's again, Kempom, #1 defensive rating, 65th offensive rating. You can get. We've seen Cinderella, and we've seen teams go deep with not a top 10 on one of those sides. You can see it like if a team has a top 10 offense or defensive rating, you can see that kind of carry the team. But 65 is just brutal for all the reasons you mentioned too. I love Rick Pitino, and I really like the St. John's team. I want to pick them going far, but I completely agree for those same reasons. I'm also pretty out on St. John's too. Don't sleep on Drake. I know people are talking about Missouri and how good they are offensively. Drake will drag them into the mud and essentially force them to play Drake's game. And I have Drake over Missouri. Drake Texas Tech is a very intriguing matchup for me as well. David, I'll hand it over to you, but first I just want to mention as well we'll address the elephant in the room. I see a Drake in this conference in this NCAA March Madness tournament. I don't see a Kendrick anywhere, so I'm just saying we'll see what happens. But I'm just saying, Davian, your thoughts on the West?
Yeah, I mean, guys, as you guys were talking, I was kind of just playing around with my bracket, just like as you guys were talking, just changing it around. And honestly, I gotta believe in the vibes. I gotta believe in the Crabs. I gotta root for the Terps. And I got the Terps coming out of this conference, beating St. John's. I got Drake going pretty far. I got them going to Sweet 16. Just because I believe that this is a really underrated team that has been pretty hot. I think that they could handle Texas Tech. Although it'll be close. And again, there's a lot of these games where I think I could be completely wrong. And I think out of the three of you guys, I will be the most wrong because at the end of the day, Florida is not just like, oh, well, it's the best team, so of course you're going to pick them. No, like they are the best team on paper, on everything. And Jonah, I mean, you said that it's the easiest route. I wouldn't say it's the easiest route. I kind of agree with more with Raffi. That's like the most loaded. I think it's one of the most loaded quadrants. But at the end of the day, like Florida, I think could handle everyone with ease out of here and make it to the Final Four without even a sweat. But yeah, I got Maryland coming out of this quadrant.
I will say too, the big thing for Texas Tech, in my opinion, that'll also dictate their run. And David, if your prediction is true about Drake going to the Sweet 16, Texas Tech has had a lot of issues down the stretch with their health. So if there was a reason why you'd be hesitant, or I'd be hesitant to pick Texas Tech going far, that injury situation is definitely a pretty big signal for me where it's like, I don't know how far this team's going to go. Obviously, injuries can happen spontaneously as well. We saw with Houston last year where they got completely derailed due to some big injuries. So injuries for the most part are unpredictable, but we know the injuries coming in, and Texas Tech is certainly a team that I at least have circled as a little bit of caution before I predict them going super far. Let's move into the East. Jonah, we'll just start with you and your thoughts. I think personally, I like Duke and Alabama. I think there's some sleeper teams. I like BYU. I like St. Mary's, but I want to hear your thoughts first before we completely dive in, before I and Davian give our thoughts as well.
Yeah, so I alluded to the fact that I think Duke is a worse team without Cooper Flag. I know they have a lot of talent on that team, but we saw them in North Carolina. They almost blew a 20-point lead over a team who I know they're in the field, and they're actually talented. They have no business being in this field. I'm sorry, but basically, they clearly weren't there without him and without Malik. And when they come back, they might not be 100%. It might affect them. So I'm gonna proceed with caution on them. Bama, I think Bama is gonna be the team. Bama right now is the team I have coming out of this region. They're not particularly balanced as well. Like obviously they're incredible on offense and a little less incredible on defense, but I think they're good enough on defense to where they can make a run. Like they're 32nd in defensive efficiency compared to St. John's at 65th in offensive. I think Mississippi State can actually cause Duke some problems because they're an extremely physical team. They will make you fight for every single bucket, and if Duke isn't healthy, that could come back to bite Duke.
Yeah, appreciate it, Jonah. Yeah, Raffi, it's my turn to speak because I actually also agree. Bama's coming out of this quadrant. I think that Duke's kind of like Raffi. You started talking about this. Duke's health problems concerns me. Raffi, we've recorded 101, like over 101 episodes now. You know, for me, injuries is a key factor in terms of picking teams, like teams who are going to win in the regular season, postseason. But it's March Madness, and every single little detail counts. And Cooper Flag's lingering injury, he might be completely healthy heading into this tournament, and I can really believe that. I mean, he's a monster of a player, and I could see him just blowing off. But at the end of the day, I do have Bama coming out of here. I do think that this is also a quadrant where we could potentially see a lot of upsets, a lot of underdog teams really going far. Especially in Akron and Vandy, two teams that have had some major upsets and have been playing very well. Especially just like throughout the season. I wouldn't say down the stretch, but throughout the season they've had their highlights, they've had their moments. So yeah, I got Bama coming out of this quadrant.
I think the big thing for me that put me on the Bama train was Grant Nelson. Earlier today, Nate Oates said that he's good to go. He's going to be probable for their first matchup. I don't really think that they need him for the first matchup. I think you take it easy and you just rest him. But he's likely to play in their next matchup, provided they win on Sunday. So Grant Nelson being good to go is a big good to go for me. I'm down with picking Alabama over Duke. Again, the Cooper Flag thing. He had a swollen ankle. It's concerning me. If he's healthy, I think this Duke team can obviously go all the way to the lead. I think they can win the championship if they're healthy. But this Cooper Flag situation kind of rubs me the wrong way. Also, everyone's picking Duke. I have bias. I don't like Duke at all. So there's that as well. I'll just throw it out there just so everyone knows. I don't like Duke in the first place. So I have Alabama. This is another difficult, before we move on, I really liked BYU last year. I had BYU going really far last year, and they proceeded not to make a single shot in their first matchup game versus, it starts with a D. I don't even remember what the name was. It was a brutal watch for me. BYU was I want to pick them going far again, but I'm just going to hesitate just because another team that I really like potentially going far in VCU is playing them. And I think both teams play different styles. VCU is more defensively minded. BYU is very offensively minded. And I think one of those two teams can cause some chaos. I like St. Mary's too to potentially cause some chaos. Those are all three teams I really like. But unfortunately, BYU is playing VCU. St. Mary's going to play Alabama. I think both teams are going to put up like 80 plus points. I think that's just going to be a high flying offense. And the big thing too, Wisconsin. Okay, you just lost your Big Ten championship. Okay, you have 3 days, and now you're going to be playing at a higher altitude for this tournament for the first two matchups. I don't think that bodes well for Wisconsin either. So that'll certainly be something interesting. But I think if Duke gets bounced early, I think this whole quadrant is just going to delve into complete utter chaos. Let's move in now to the Midwest. Midwest, I have Houston taking care of business pretty nicely. I think Houston is arguably, if not the best, one of the best teams in the country. I love their body work. There's a reason why I picked them to win the Big 12. Again, the big thing is always just going to be injuries with them. We've seen how injuries have derailed them in the past. But I just think this team is due. As Davian heard, I had Illinois winning the Big Ten championship because this team, I bet on them being the Illinois that is one of the top teams in the country. When this Illinois team is shooting well and is on fire, this team is one of the best teams in the country. They're a top 10 team in the country. The problem is they in the same tone will also look like the 300th best team in the country, where they forget how to shoot, they turn over the ball, they can't play defense, and you wonder how this team is even a Big Ten team and even ranked as high as a 6th seed. So it's a big concern for me. Lamont Butler being out for Kentucky is another concern for me. So with all that in mind, I have Houston taking care of business. I've been playing Tennessee, and I have Houston advancing to the Final Four out of here. Gonzaga, Jonah, I know you indicated Gonzaga, so I'll hand it over to you for that matchup. But Gonzaga did give me a little bit of caution, but even at, like, I still don't, they lost to St. Mary's twice this year. I know they had a solid non-conference schedule and competition, but I think this Gonzaga team is getting a little inflated, in my personal opinion, even though all the metrics say watch out for this Gonzaga team.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thank you, Raffi. So Gonzaga is it was an interesting seeing discussion with them. I thought they would be seeded more like they were last year, where they were actually a 5 seed despite having a pretty similar resume. This year, the committee decided to change it up a bit, got an 8. I think that's fair. I actually think good job committee here. But having said that, I still think that Gonzaga, we saw what they were doing end of last year, where they kind of struggled a bit. They heated up, they really got in their groove, and they started they just started becoming dominant. Like Gonzaga, they were not the better team in the first 2 games against St. Mary's. They were absolutely the better team in that West Coast Conference championship. And St. Mary's is no slouch either. I really think Gonzaga can cause this Houston team problems, and I'm going to have that upset. This is going to be my region that opens up a lot. It's going to be a lot of people are going to have some upsets along the very common upset lines. Right as of now, I have Clemson coming out of this bracket.
Wow.
That's a good pick. Yeah. I like Clemson a lot too. I really do. And again, for me personally, it just came down to I think Houston's better. But these ACC schools, I know I harped on Duke and was against Duke. I was also against North Carolina too, for the Duke fans out there who are watching this podcast. I was against North Carolina as well. I don't even think they should be in this tournament. But Clemson and Louisville are 2 teams that I think people really need to keep an eye on because, again, as you said, I think they can both cause some chaos. They can also be out in the first weekend too. So I think they're pretty fun, personally, in my opinion. Davian, what are your thoughts on the East?
Yeah, I feel like the winner of Clemson McNeese is going to go far. But the issue is that game is so I feel like that McNeese is they could be a Cinderella story. I feel like them and UC just don't want to say it wrong. UC San Diego are 2 teams that can both kind of put up like that Cinderella story that we all love and want to see in March. But at the end of the day, I do see Clemson beating McNeese and making it pretty far. But then at the end of the day, I do have Houston handling business and Houston coming out of this quadrant.
All right, let's get into Final Four predictions. This year, especially last year, I think was pretty easy overall. I think UConn versus Purdue was a pretty easy pick overall, especially with UConn winning the national championship. Obviously, I went with Arizona instead. That was more statistical based, and because I wanted to win. And UConn decided, no, we're actually going to win this all as well. Screw your metrics. So it is what it is. But this was a hard bracket for me to really invest in a 3 or 4 seed or a lower seed and be like, you know what? I really, really think this team can go far. We see it every year. And personally, if I had to pick a quadrant, that Duke quadrant is a very interesting one. I think the South can, if there's any chaotic quadrant, I think the South can certainly be that quadrant as well. My Final Four, I have Florida versus Michigan State. I have Houston versus Alabama. I originally had Florida beating Houston, but then I realized the Final Four is in San Antonio, which is 3 hours away from Houston. It's really hard to pick against Houston then with them playing so close. And if I have Houston in the national championship, I'm assuming that they're healthy. And I think Houston defensively can give Florida's offense a really good run for their money. So I have Houston over Florida in my national championship. Jonah, what are your thoughts? And what is your Final Four?
Yeah. So honestly, I respect the take a lot. I guess my one concern with Houston is that I do think they have a bit of a bad draw. So I'm scared to project them in my Final Four as a top seed. But other than that, they're so good on both sides of the ball. We've seen the difference that Crier
100%.
makes. But yeah, right now my Final Four. So it's going to be chalk once we get to the Final Four. So I have I have Florida beating Michigan State. I just think Florida is too like I think they just have too much talent on that team. I think there's a reason why they are the betting. Why they're I think they're tied with Duke right now as the favorite to cut down the nets.
They're tied. Yeah.
Yeah, which I
Mhm.
think is appropriate. I would have Florida ahead of them by a good amount due to concern with Duke. And then on the other half of the bracket, I do have Bama beating Clemson, and actually what is a rematch from last year's NCAA tournament, but in the Elite Eight, where where I think Bama was a 4 and Clemson was a 6. They both went on runs. I anticipate them both going on runs
Yep.
again. They're well coached teams. They're built for March, and I think we can see. I'm anticipating a Florida Bama rematch in the finals.
Wow,
That's fun.
that is a
All
fun
right.
matchup.
Davian,
Speaking of fun matchups, I got a interesting Big Ten matchup happening in the Final Four. Michigan against
everyone
Maryland.
gets eliminated due to substance abuse, and Rutgers by proxy wins
Yes,
the national.
yes. No, no. As much as I dream about that happening, and seeing Dylan Harper and Ace Bailey, celebrate as national champions. They'll be celebrating as NBA champions. I'm sure in a few years. But who will be celebrating this year in San Antonio? Well, I have Michigan beating Maryland in the Final Four, and I have Bama beating Houston in the Final Four, setting up a Michigan-Bama final, with Michigan winning it all.
Wow. And honestly, low key, the South.
Don't sleep
I
on
wish I
Michigan. I'm
liked.
telling you. I'm telling
I
you.
wish I liked Michigan enough to put them versus Michigan State in the Elite Eight, because that would feed families. That would be an amazing matchup.
Yeah, I
Auburn
can't wait for that.
Alabama is a national championship game. Oh my goodness, like bro, that's just too much.
Yeah.
That's gonna be
Yeah.
that would be insane. So there's everyone's Final Fours. Does anyone have any final thoughts? Any teams that you're like, you know what, I really really like this team. I think they could go on a Cinderella run, but I don't want to commit. Any final thoughts from anyone before we close the show?
Yeah, I'll start. So, in case I didn't say it, I do have Florida beating Bama in the finals. It's going to be a pretty high scoring game, like all those SEC games are. And final thoughts: teams I think could make a run. As much as as I said, I had Clemson in the final four. Watch out for High Point. Those kids from Carolina, they shoot the ball with incredible efficiency. They they just don't have a quit. Like they were down by like 15 to Winthrop in that Big South championship. They clawed their way back, and it's a team that honestly has underperformed a bit considering how good this team looks when you watch them. And just for one thing, I know because Davey and I are at Cornell, we're going to be looking at that East bracket a bit as there's actually two former Cornell players.
Yep.
There's Isaiah Gray on Akron,
Akron.
and then Chris Mannion, who is on Vandy right now, both
Yep.
who are made their way into March Madness this year. And it'll be exciting to see them because they both play meaningful roles on their team as well.
Yes, they did. Yeah, and they're amazing and super exciting to watch at Cornell. And I've seen some highlights from them playing at Vandy and Akron. They've been really contributing a lot to the teams, and it'll be really exciting to see. I agree with that. In terms of anything else I have to say, again, don't sleep on Vandy, don't sleep on Akron, don't sleep on Drake. I mean, I know that a lot of people have been saying that, but I really think that, and also I think that we're gonna see a big size win this tournament. I think it's gonna be less about how well you can shoot the three. And I think it's gonna be more so how well can you be in the paint, fight in the paint. And as much as I hate Yale because they did beat Cornell, at the end of the day, Yale is also another team you can't sweep on. Those Bulldogs, they know how to play, and Texas A&M they've been a shaky team. They've been a very, very shaky team, and I could, as much as I, horns down at them day, I could see Yale also making a run for it.
I mean, my team, like, I have to go with Illinois just because, again, I have Illinois losing in the Sweet 16, but this team as a 6 seed is so dangerous and it's so tempting to pick them going really far. But again, you think that they turned a corner and then they get blown out by 40 points at MSG by Duke. But if this team figures it out, which who knows at this point, but if they figure it out, I wouldn't be shocked if this team goes all the way to the Final Four. And one point on a high point too, very intrigued on Purdue just because last year they finally broke through and actually lived up to their expectations, making it all the way to the national championship game. Historically, especially over the past several appearances for Purdue, Purdue has consistently lost to double-digit seeds. So Purdue versus High Point, that is an interesting matchup. We'll see if Purdue's finally turned that corner and is finally a perennial contender, a team that you can feel comfortable picking deep, or if they're just coming back down to earth and losing to double-digit seeds again. So we'll see what happens. But before we close, Jonah, I know you're talking about your bracketology. Do you want to plug that? Where can people find your bracketology? Where can people find you? Just because for people like me who love looking at as many bracketologies as possible, another bracketology for me is always a benefit in my mind. So if there's anything you want to plug before we close this thing out, the mic's all yours.
Yeah, of course. So first, the one thing I would like to plug above anything else is the bracket matrix. And it is as easy as www.bracketmatrix.com. And it takes an aggregate of every single bracket that people project and they put it into a sheet, and it turns into a competition of sorts to see how everyone's bracket stacks up against each other. If you want to look at mine specifically, I have mine at bracketpedia.blogspot.com. And also on there, I might make the occasional post just about anything in the college basketball world. Like I made like a bubble team write-up going into all the power conference tournaments, seeing what teams might have to do to get into the tournament. Spoiler alert, I was wrong. North Carolina did not have to beat Duke, and Xavier did not have to beat Marquette.
Yeah.
100%. So make sure you guys check them out. All that stuff, it's all going to be plugged also in the description of this video as well. So if you want to check it out in the description of this video. Be sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel as well. Jonah, thank you for coming on. We appreciate and loved your college basketball insight. You truly do know ball. Davian, always a pleasure. And just for everyone, we hope you enjoyed this edition of the Benchwarmer Sports Podcast. Have a good one. March is here. Enjoy March Madness and have a good one. See ya.
Peace.